Hello and welcome back to the Butter Web Design podcast. Today we're going to be looking at the top 5 web design mistakes to avoid at all costs. I've got my blog open if you're listening to this on podcast, or if you're watching the YouTube video, you can go to butterwebdesign.com and look at the blog and you'll find the actual visuals that go along with this post. So let's get right into it. The very first mistake that I see in web design is rebuilding the website, making the website sleek and new, and investing all that time and money in the redesign without reconsidering your branding. If you're rebuilding your website, chances are it's been a number of years since you've looked at your branding, your logo, your colors, your font choices. And because branding is such an important consideration as far as the subconscious decisions that people make about your company based on your branding, you can be kind of getting the cart in front of the horse in a sense by having a website that is brand new with dated branding. So have a look at your branding, make sure that it doesn't look old or doesn't adequately reflect what your company is all about. Maybe try to create an anonymous poll on social media or ask 10 strangers what they think of your logo. Try to get somebody who is giving you their opinion who isn't already invested in a relationship with you. So don't ask your friends and family because they might not tell you the absolute truth for fear of hurting your feelings. So get a sense for whether or not the logo for your company and the branding you've decided to go with is up to par. And if it isn't, invest a little bit of time up front rediscovering what your branding will look like before rebuilding the website. The website itself often draws inspiration as far as colors and font choices from your branding. So getting that right first is a better idea than having to revisit it later. Another issue that I see a lot of is point number 2, cluttering the top navigation area. And this actually spills over from the branding idea. If your logo is too big on the homepage, it will push the navigation farther down and it kind of creates this big open space where you're tempted to stuff other information like your business hours, your phone number, email. Not that those things aren't important, but they all have their place. I see people try to get every single social media icon into that top navigation area, and it's distracting. It doesn't create the sense that your website has that professional feel if it's got all these different colorful social media logos in the top. If you want to add your social media in the top, in that top navigation, you can, but try to make it subtle. Maybe instead of using the actual branded colors of Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, maybe you choose just subtle gray logos for each of those, or simply the Facebook F or the Twitter little bird, and those can all be sort of tucked off to the top right. I tend to think a better place for those is actually in the footer, because in the footer, they've already perused your website and then they're getting to your social media at the bottom. I tend to think that the purpose of social media is actually to funnel traffic from external websites to your website. So sending people off of your website to your social media can be counterproductive, especially if you don't want them to get distracted, right? Because if they go out to social media, you're not really in control of what their calls to action are anymore. They're probably going to see a video of a kitten or a puppy or something and then forget what they came to your website for in the first place. So try to keep that top navigation area clean. Try to control how many bits of information are in the top. If you want to have your phone number, great, but try to leave it at that. The next mistake, number 3, is featuring low quality photos on the website. So photos that are pixelated, or they started out as too low resolution for the application and then the theme starts to pull and stretch and skew the image. The best way by far to get your website to look extremely professional is to have professional photography, because images make up such a significant portion of the experience visually of your website. It really pays to have professional photos. And I have an example on the blog post here. If you are on my Butter blog, you can see there are 2 carpentry companies, and one of them has this sort of half resolution or half website width washed out low res picture of this really nicely built fence, but you really can't make out any of the details because the website itself was the photo was taken maybe on a phone, and maybe they didn't like clean the lens of the phone first, so it's got this like glare to the picture, and it's, you know, not very carefully cropped, and so then you can see pictures of, or you can see imagery in the background of trees that really aren't interesting or useful to be in that photo. And then the comparison photo is right below it, where it's professionally shot, it's really nicely lit. You can tell there was some post-production done in Photoshop to help sharpen up the details of the focal points of the photograph, and to adjust the levels to make sure that the bright whites are not too washed out. Because the room is in full white, it can, you know, there's that danger of that happening. And it just looks way better, and there's really nothing you can do to overcome bad photography. So just like when you're doing your photography, when you're thinking about the photography for your website, if it comes down to spending a little bit extra on hiring a photographer for a day to take really good photos, absolutely do it. You can use those photos in all of your marketing, not just your website, and I think it'll really help people establish that trust when they come to your website, when they see, wow, these people really did take the time to put together beautiful photos and stage images that are going to be representing what they do. So that consideration, on a subconscious level, the viewer is going to think that that consideration bleeds into everything else you do. These are assumptions that website visitors make that you want to be aware of, so that you can play into it and not be making mistakes unintentionally because of it. That said, if you're not going to be hiring a professional photographer, you can take really, really good photos with your iPhone X, for example. It's got that double back-facing lens, or the thing where you're able to take a photo and it creates depth of fields through the software that post-processes the image. Like, you can get some really crazy results. My brother-in-law's iPhone, or I think he's got a Google Pixel, and it takes better photos than my Canon DSLR. Like, it's really astonishing what these cameras, what these phones can do these days. So if you have a modern phone, you might be taking beautiful photos. And as long as you know sort of these next basic concepts that I'll hop into here, you're going to probably be able to take good enough photos yourself if you have a modern phone. The first consideration to make is to beware of the lighting. So you want your subject to be lit from the front. So if the sun is shining on the person you're taking, or the thing you're taking a photo of, make sure that you have the sun to your back, and that the detail is better lit in the thing that you're shooting, because the light source is behind you, not behind them. If you have the subject of your photo between you and the light source, good chance that you're going to lose a lot of the detail, and you're going to have this silhouette happening. If you take a little bit of time to clean up your shots and create some composition, get a little bit closer to the thing you're photographing, there's also a pretty good chance that you're going to have better results that way. With web design, you also want to skew the number of photos you take toward being landscape in orientation. That simply means having photos that are wider than they are tall, just because most of the devices that we use are going to display horizontal landscape orientation photographs better than portrait orientation. And that's because if you picture opening up a website on your smartphone and you're holding that smartphone in like its vertical orientation, when you have a vertical photograph, it's going to take up most of that space, and it's going to push all of the content further down on the screen, requiring the user to scroll in order to reach it. So for that reason, most layouts in websites make use of landscape orientation photos. So when you're taking your pictures, use landscape orientation. Hold your phone sideways when you're taking pictures. The next big mistake that I see a lot of in web design is having an unclear hierarchy of information. And this most often happens when you have a business in charge of a website, maybe multiple contributors, maybe you have a lot of information on the site, and it's hard to tell even internally, even with the people who are even amongst the people who are in charge of the website or in charge of producing the content for that business, it's unclear to them what's being emphasized. And so everything sort of clamors for attention, and you end up with a website that is full of information, and that information can be highly useful and valuable, but there's no order of consumption. There's no order at which you would have somebody walk through that information and absorb it. And that can be overwhelming, especially if there's a lot of information. So what you want to do is think about the personas, the types of people who are coming to your site specifically. So you want to think, okay, in as great or as fine a detail or as high resolution a persona as I can create in my mind, what specifically is each of these personas coming to my website for, and what information can I make prominent so that when they come to the website, they see that information and they're able to easily notice it on a page that might also have other links, other elements, other images that are vying for that attention. And you can achieve this hierarchy of information through a multitude of design techniques. A big one is size, so to speak. So you can have text be a little bit larger and in a heading tag, and that's going to grab attention simply because it's bigger and more noticeable. Another way of doing it is with color. So if you have something that's a different color or an accent color, that is going to grab people's attention. So you want to be conservative with how you use those accent colors, and you want to kind of reserve the use of color, especially bright or high contrast color, for user action. So if you have buttons that you want your users to click in order to get in touch with you, go to a contact page or fill out a form or sign up for a survey or something like this, then you want that to be your highest attention grabbing, highest level in the hierarchy of design. If it's like on my website, I use yellow as like the brightest, most attention grabbing color. That's the one you want for that button that you want your user to actually engage with. So the final, I believe we're on the second last option here. The fourth common web design mistake that I see a lot of is just back to the information and kind of having a lot of it and not knowing what to do with it. That tends to express itself or manifest itself on websites in the form of overstuffed navigation menus. So you come to a website and the menu is full of links, and each of those menu items has a drop down attached to it, and maybe you hover over that drop down and it has dozens of links within it, and each of those has, or several of them have, a secondary drop down which is no longer even W3C compliant. So you're not actually supposed to even do that anymore for accessibility and mobile friendliness reasons. So that's a situation where you need to rethink how you're curating your content and moving people through your website. If your website's that large that you're finding your navigation menu is starting to get a little bit unwieldy. So you want to, if that's the case, start to guide people to pages, secondary and tertiary pages, where they can start to navigate deeper and deeper into the site. And you want to start thinking about using breadcrumbs in order to conveniently give them those back steps out of a rabbit hole into your site's information. Now, it can be difficult to broadly categorize the sections of your website into a menu with only half a dozen links, but sitting down and really thinking about how to navigate your information, broad swaths of your information with a more sparse menu, is going to pay off, because when people come to your site, they're not going to be overwhelmed. And if they're not overwhelmed, they'll be more likely to stay a little bit longer. When they stay longer and you're limiting the flow of information to them, your website is going to have a lower bounce rate. So people aren't just coming to your site and then leaving immediately because they're overwhelmed. And a lower bounce rate is going to help your Google ranking position, or at least one of them. Google weighs in all these different factors, and one of them is bounce rate, in order to adequately assign a rank to where your website's going to appear in search results. So designing for that more comfortable user experience does include limiting the information that you put in your navigation menu if your website is information heavy. And the final web design mistake is having too much text at too high a reading level. I'm going to butcher this quote, but let's just go with Hemingway. Was it Hemingway? I don't know who wrote this, but some famous person once said, "I'm sorry for the long letter, I didn't have time to write the short one." And that's so true. When we sit down to write something to somebody or compose any content for any reason, quite often the first draft is longer than the final draft. And that's because our minds are just kind of spilling out information. We're kind of this fire hose of content that is trying to make its way into something that's useful or valuable to somebody. And during that process, it can be very useful to edit and to pare down wordy information into something that's more simple, direct, and concise. And when it comes to absorbing website information, a lot of the time your website users, your website visitors are going to be distracted. They're going to be listening to music. They're going to be in a coffee shop, or maybe they're on your website on their phone in the park with their kid. They don't necessarily always have full cognitive horsepower. They don't have all of their attention to apply to reading your copy, the text on your website. And if they don't have their full mental capacity, their full cognitive resources at hand to bring to bear upon your very high academic or technical or wordy paragraphs, then you run the risk of them just being overwhelmed and lost and want to leave your website. The way to retain somebody's attention is to feed them information that is easy to understand. So you're trying to limit the syllables of your words. You're not using long university level academic words. You're using kind of like grade 8 and below writing, so that if you were to have essentially a child read your website text, they're going to be able to understand it. And a lot of the time, that's going to work better than the very complicated information, especially on something like a homepage. You want your homepage to be able to communicate what your website is about in moments and as directly and simply as possible. And you might have to rewrite that message of what your website is about, what you do. You might have to rewrite that 5 or 6 times and have like your children or friends' kids read it and tell you whether or not they understand it, and try to tell that same message back to you, repeat the message back to you in their own words. And maybe those words are more useful than the words that you tried to put on your website in the first place. All of this is simply to say, simplify your writing, avoid big blocks of text. Big blocks of text are difficult to scan, and you can often break them up into, smaller paragraphs, 1 or 2 sentences per line. It makes for a more airy reading experience. It's going to make your text more approachable, especially if there's a lot of it. And it invites the opportunity to insert headings and pictures and quotes and things that are going to help make your text more dynamic and more approachable and essentially more enjoyable to consume. So, in conclusion, web design mistakes are easy to make. So don't get down on yourself if you found yourself making them, but at least now you will have the awareness to go back and fix them. So what you want to do is avoid, number 1, building a website that has inferior branding that doesn't adequately represent your business or your company. Make sure your branding is sharp before you rebuild your site. Number 2, high quality photos go a long way to make your website seem much more professional. Number 3, establish a strong hierarchy of information. Number 4, don't overstuff the navigation menu. And number 5, be sure that your text is easy enough for an 8th grader to understand. Thank you for tuning in to the podcast, watching the video, reading the blog. I'll link to my early wins checklist, which is a way of getting more leads to your website without even having a rebuilt website or even having a website in the first place. That checklist includes developing your social media profiles, your Google Places listing, getting social proof going with testimonials. All this stuff you can do yourself for free. So check out that checklist below. I'll link to it below. If you're watching the video, and if you're listening to the podcast, go to butterwebdesign.com/checklist to get it there. Thanks for watching. Comment if you have any questions, and hit the thumbs up and subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks.